For nearly a century, archaeology operated under a strict consensus. Humans first arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago. The evidence for this timeline was anchored entirely by these distinct fluted stone tools, known as Clovis points. According to the standard model, early hunter-gatherers crossed from Siberia into Alaska via a land bridge called Beringia. As massive glaciers finally began to retreat, an ice-free corridor opened up, allowing them to move south into the heart of the continent. Today, the expansive, rolling gypsum dunes of White Sands National Park in New Mexico form a stark, brilliantly white desert. It is a harsh, arid environment, quite different from the lush grasslands that covered this exact spot during the Ice Age. But buried beneath those shifting white sands is fossilized evidence that directly contradicts that 13,000-year law. Below the modern surface lies the dried bed of ancient Lake Otero. Pressed into its muddy shoreline are thousands of intersecting fossilized footprints. These tracks capture behavior in real time. One set shows human hunters actively pursuing a giant ground sloth. We can see the exact spot where the massive animal began to pivot and spin on its hind legs to defend itself. Another trackway tells a quieter story. An adult walked for over a mile carrying a toddler. The prints show where she occasionally set the child down and where she slipped in the wet mud from the extra weight. The vast majority of the shoreline tracks belong to teenagers and children. They are clustered near the water's edge, splashing in puddles left by mammoths and running errands while adults worked elsewhere. These intersecting tracks capture an entire active society caught in real-time motion. Mixed in among those footprints, researchers found something highly unusual: long, linear grooves pressed into the mud, categorized as type 1, 2, and 3 traces. The type 3 traces are highly specific. They consist of 2 parallel, continuous grooves, spaced exactly 250 to 350 millimeters apart, tracking perfectly alongside human footprints. Researchers matched this geometry to the drag marks of a travois. A travois is a simple, sled-like frame made of wooden poles tied together, pulled behind a person to transport heavy loads. This setup allowed ancient people to drag meat, firewood, and gathered resources across the landscape, rather than carrying everything on their backs. These grooves represent the earliest evidence of transportation technology in the Americas, proof that these inhabitants were adapted engineers who had solved the logistical challenge of moving heavy resources through a frozen landscape. To figure out exactly when these people lived, archaeologists extracted seeds from an aquatic plant called Rupia serosa, which were embedded directly inside the footprints. Radiocarbon testing returned a date between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. That timeline caused immediate friction. Skeptics pointed to a chemical quirk known as the hard water effect. This occurs when aquatic plants absorb old carbon directly from groundwater instead of fresh atmospheric carbon. If seeds absorbed this recycled carbon, they would test thousands of years older, pushing the prints back to 15,000 years ago and rescuing the Clovis-first theory. To settle the chemistry, researchers returned to the site in 2023. They applied 2 entirely different dating methods: optically stimulated luminescence to date the quartz crystals in the sand, and radiocarbon dating on terrestrial pollen, which grows on land and is immune to the hard water effect. Both independent tests landed precisely in the 21,000 to 23,000 year window. The dates matched the original seeds perfectly, making the timeline chemically bulletproof. At 23,000 years old, these footprints place humans deep in the American Southwest during the last glacial maximum, the absolute coldest stretch of the Ice Age. This map shows North America's geographic reality. Massive ice sheets completely blocked the 2 main entryways, the Pacific coast and the inland corridor. This creates a paradox. If humans reached New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they crossed thousands of years prior, before ice closed those routes. We're talking about walls of solid ice, miles thick, grinding across a frozen landscape. Crossing them on foot, during the peak of the Ice Age, was physically impossible. Because the old timeline cannot be reconciled with the planet's physical geography, the accepted math of human migration into the Americas is now obsolete. For the indigenous communities who collaborated on the White Sands research, these dates align with their own history. Their oral traditions maintain that their ancestors lived on this continent since time immemorial. It took decades of debate, optical luminescence dating, and particle accelerators to scientifically verify what was already preserved right in the ground. These tracks serve as a physical reminder that historical consensus is never entirely settled. A century of scientific certainty was overturned by the quiet, undeniable impression of a teenager's foot in the mud.